On April 18th, 1999, police entered Christopher Case's apartment and they discovered his body. The coroner came in and was able to determine in relative short order that Christopher had died of natural causes. But when friends and family got a hold of the coroner's report, they turned to the police and they were like, wait, have you not heard what was happening to Chris in the week leading up to his death? And so police began interviewing the friends and family of Christopher Case, and they unraveled this totally insane story that to this day baffles investigators. Christopher Case predicted his own death. But before we get started, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do. And I upload at least 3 to 4 times a week. And I'm actually trying to get to 5 times a week. So I'm all in on this thing. And if that's what you're into, then please, if you would, gently slap the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. By early 1999, Christopher Case was living his best life. He was 35 years old. He had moved out to Seattle to pursue a career in music, and he had landed a job at a music company in Seattle, and he had risen to the rank of executive at that company. He was incredibly fit. He was known for being at the gym 7 days a week. He took vitamins, he took his health very seriously. He had loads of friends. People really liked him. He was very close with his family. And, despite all that, despite his popularity and success, he had been single for years. And even though he was not actively seeking a companion, his friends and family were continuously trying to set him up on dates. But Chris would prefer to not go on a date and actually stay home by himself and listen to music, because Chris had an obsession with a very specific type of music. He loved music from ancient times, specifically from Egypt. And so he would stay home instead of go out on dates and, crush ancient Egyptian music. That was like his idea of a great night. On April 11th of 1999, Chris was on a business trip because part of his job required a ton of travel. And he was on a trip with a couple of his coworkers, who were also friends of his. They go out to San Francisco, and on the 11th, they decide to go out for dinner that night. And one of his co-workers decides to bring along a friend who was someone that lived in the area. So they get to dinner, and one of them has their friend, who's an older woman, very attractive, very kind of intense-looking woman. She was about 20 years older than Chris. That was his guess. And she sits down, and the four of them are just kind of having a nice conversation. And at some point, the older woman really takes an interest in Chris. And Chris takes an interest in her because it would turn out that they had a lot in common. And then she actually admitted to him that she was really into music from ancient times and actually has a specific interest in music from ancient Egypt. And so to Chris, he's like, how can this be? And he's like, this is my passion. I love that type of music. And they really hit it off. Now, Chris was not looking for any sort of romantic involvement with this woman. He was just so excited to talk about something he loved. And so all night, Chris and this older woman are chatting it up, and they're super into each other. He was looking at her purely from a platonic sense, but it was becoming clear by the end of the night, at least Chris was realizing this, that she was looking at him with a romantic angle. She was interested in Chris. And in fact, right as he's kind of realizing this, she asks him if he wants to leave with her and go back to her place. And he politely declines because he's not interested. He loved chatting with her about music and other things they had in common, but he wasn't interested in her romantically. And she became a little bit more aggressive and said, no, come on, let's get out of here. I got a place right down the road. We can go listen to music and hang out in my place. And he felt really uncomfortable and kept saying no, but she wouldn't let it go. And so finally, as she's literally trying to get him to say yes, he says, hey, you know what? I've had a long night. I'm going to go. And so he stands up to leave, and the woman goes from being very flirtatious and friendly to very angry at Chris. And she looks at him and kind of abruptly says to him,
I'm actually a witch, and I'm going to put a curse on you. You're going to be dead within a week.
Okay. And he just leaves. So the next morning, on April 12th, Chris gets up and he heads to the airport and he flies back to Seattle. When he lands in Seattle, he calls his friend Sammy, who was one of his very close friends back when he lived on the East Coast. He just wanted to share this weird experience with a close friend, and so they're kind of laughing about the whole thing. Neither of them are taking the curse seriously at all. It was like, you really dodged a bullet. It's good you did not go home with her. So in good spirits, Chris hangs up the phone with Sammy, and for the next 24 hours, Chris would fall right back into his regular daily life in Seattle. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. But all that would change starting the night of April 13th, which would have been 48 hours after his encounter with this woman in San Francisco. So Chris lives alone. He doesn't have pets. And he gets into bed that night, and he's laying there, and before he falls asleep, he hears whispering coming from outside of his bedroom in the kitchen area, kind of near the front door. And he's thinking to himself, like, I didn't just hear whispering. What? No one's in here. What's going on? And he's hearing the whispering, and then it kind of stops. And before he gets up to investigate, he's like, okay, I probably was just hearing things. That wasn't real. And he's just kind of laying there trying to go to sleep, and then he hears it again. Except now it's not coming from the kitchen area. It's coming from a separate area in his apartment outside of the room he's in. And so now he's wondering, like, did someone sneak into my house? Like, is there a burglar in my house right now? And so he quietly gets out of his bed and he walks over to his door, he opens it up, and he can still hear the whispering, and it's coming from like his laundry room a little ways away. But as soon as he opens the door and he pokes his head out, the whispering stops. And he's just standing there, like, looking around, like, hoping that there isn't anything in his apartment. And then out of the corner of his eye, near the front door, he sees something dash across his periphery. Like a shadowy figure basically darts across the room. And so he looks over, and he's immediately afraid that it really is a burglar in his room. And as he's looking, he's turning the light on next to him, he's looking around, and he starts hearing the whispering again, and now it's coming from another section of his house. So he just starts turning on all the lights and looking around to try to, like, make sure no one's in his apartment. He's not even thinking about the whispering. He's just looking for this shadowy figure that he saw run past him. And so he's looking all over his apartment. All the lights are on. It's a small apartment. And as soon as he feels comfortable that the door is locked still, everything's locked, and there's nobody here, that's when he realizes that that whispering is still happening. And so he turns back around, and now the whispering is coming from his bedroom where he was. And so he walks over to his bedroom and looks inside, and he can't pinpoint the whispering. Like, he keeps hearing it and walking to wherever it's coming from, and as soon as he gets near it, the whispering stops. And he's thinking to himself, like, am I dreaming? Is this a dream? Am I losing my mind? Did somebody slip me something, like, last night? Like, what's wrong with me? So he has this horrible night where he's up all night chasing down whispers in his apartment that keep vanishing, and then seeing shadowy figures running around and lurking in corners. But he can't ever see them when he looks at them. And so the next morning on April 14th, when the sun comes up, he hasn't slept, the first phone call he makes is to Sammy, his friend. And he's totally panicked. And we know about this phone call because Sammy would tell police about all her interactions with Chris over the course of this week. She would say that he was totally panicked. And she even thought, as she's taking this phone call, that it's just so weird, that Chris is scared of noises in his apartment and, like, figures moving around in his apartment, because it's so unlike Chris. He's definitely a skeptic. He's just like he's a no BS kind of guy. So the idea that he would suddenly be terrified of something paranormal running around his apartment just seems so unlike him. But as she's listening to him, he was so scared about what was in his apartment. He knew it wasn't a person because he looked everywhere. There was no people. And that's the only reason he didn't call the police, is because he didn't want to tell the police that some shadow figure that's whispering in my apartment is harassing me. Like, what are the police going to do? So Sammy hangs up the phone with Chris after trying to reassure him and just hopes that whatever that was doesn't happen again. But unfortunately for Chris, the night of the 14th now, he's going to bed again, and he starts hearing the whispers, and immediately he's out there looking, lights on. He's looking for these whispers. They keep disappearing. He can't find the source. He's getting frustrated. He's scared. He keeps seeing that thing dart around his apartment. Except this night, he also noticed that he would look, and he could get close enough to where he could break out the silhouette of what looked like a person, like lingering in the corner of his apartment, but he'd go closer to it and it would disappear. It was like the manifestations of what he was seeing, the whispers and this figure running around his apartment, were becoming more vivid. But he's also thinking, like, I didn't sleep the night before. This could be my imagination. Like, I don't know if this is happening, but he's spiraling and he knows it. So the next day on the 15th, he doesn't call Sammy, but he calls a couple of his other friends that are anonymous, and they would all tell police that they got a similar story that Sammy had gotten that first night after the 14th. No matter what was happening, Chris believed it was happening, and Chris was terrified. But this wasn't even the worst of it yet. So that night on the 15th, Chris gets in bed, and now he's barely slept for 2 consecutive nights. And he's determined to just go to sleep. That he's trying to tell himself that everything that you've experienced the past couple nights is probably brought on by stress. It's brought on by now certainly a lack of sleep. So he's telling himself, like, just go to sleep. Just get in bed and go to sleep. So he gets in bed and he's laying there and he does fall asleep. But he wakes up in the middle of the night and he can't move his body. He's paralyzed. He can't move. And he's totally awake. And he starts hearing whispering. And now his level of fear is so high because now he's immobile. But the past 2 nights he's heard that whispering in his apartment and he's seen that figure moving around his apartment. And so he's laying there in darkness because he went to bed in darkness. And he starts hearing whispering outside his room, and then it stops. And then he starts hearing whispering inside of his closet, and then it stops. And then he hears whispering right underneath his bed, and he can't move. And he's just laying there praying that nothing horrible is going to happen to him, that this is just a dream. And then out from underneath his bed, right next to him, he can only turn his eyes. This black figure, this shadowy black figure emerges right next to his bed. And it's looking down at him. He can't make out any facial expressions, but he can clearly define, a figure is hovering over him. And it reaches down and puts its hands around his neck and begins to throttle him. And Chris is like gagging. He can't breathe, but he can't move. And at some point, the thing begins to lift him off of his bed by his neck and then throws him back down, and then the figure vanishes. Chris still couldn't move. He's choking to breathe, but he can't move. And he's just waiting for this thing to come back. And he knows that more than likely, whatever this is probably going to kill him this night. So he's laying there just thinking, oh my God, I'm about to die, I'm about to die. But the thing doesn't come back. And Chris can't move. And at some point, Chris, probably out of just pure, adrenaline crash or something, he falls asleep. And so when Chris wakes up and he can move again, he notices there's blood inside of his bed on his sheets. And then he looks at his hands, and at the tips of all 10 fingers, are these incisions, like someone had intentionally cut open the top of every finger, something he certainly didn't do. And his bed is covered in blood from these 10 cuts on his hands. And then he feels his neck, and it feels tender. And it turns out he had marks on his neck. It was all bruised up from this thing choking him out. And it brought him back to, that really happened. He's now, actually in fear for his life. Chris immediately calls Sammy and tells Sammy everything that happened, and Sammy can't believe any of it. She felt helpless because she's on the other side of the country. She can't help him, and Chris is just petrified. And he's he can barely speak, he's unable to articulate what's happening. He's describing these cuts on his hand and his neck, but there's no one in his apartment. And Sammy's trying to get him to call the police, but Chris is I can't call the police. What am I going to tell him? That a shadowy figure is coming in my apartment and choking me? They're going to think I'm crazy. Chris decides he's going to approach this head on. Maybe that woman in San Francisco did put some curse on me. I need to go at least research it. And so there was a religious bookstore right near his house that he figured might have some things on demonic possession and demons, the occult. And he goes in there and he kind of awkwardly approaches the store owner and is like, I'm looking for books about demons and witchcraft and how to protect yourself against that. And the guy points him towards a section of the store. And so Chris goes over there, he scoops up a whole bunch of books. He also buys a whole bundle of crucifixes. So at least 10. So he's got all these crucifixes, he's got all these books about demonic possession and witchcraft. He buys all of that and he leaves. He goes back to his apartment. When he gets back, after doing some research, he ends up putting these crucifixes all over his apartment, every room. And he takes salt and he draws a line all through his apartment against the baseboard of every wall in the house. And at every corner of the house, he'd pile up little piles of salt. He was going to do all the things that people say to do if you're dealing with demons or ghosts or anything through witchcraft. He was kind of grasping at straws a little bit. So he went out and did everything he thought he could possibly do to protect himself. That night, which was April 16th, we don't know what happened to Chris, but something scared him so badly that in the middle of the night, in a full panic, he runs out of his apartment and he checks into a hotel and does not stay at his apartment. The next morning, April 17th, when Sammy called Chris to check on him. Now remember, this is 1999. There was just landline phones. So she calls his landline at his apartment to check on him. There's no answer because he's not there. He's at the hotel. And Sammy, who's been speaking to Chris, and other friends that have been speaking to Chris, and everyone's concerned about his mental health and what's going on with him, when she doesn't get Chris to pick up his phone, she calls the police. And she says, hey, I'm concerned about my friend. Can you do a welfare check on this guy? And they go over to his apartment, and it's locked. And they kind of look in the windows, and everything just seems kind of quiet. And so they leave, and they tell Sammy, like, hey, look, it's locked. We can't really do anything. Let us know if you don't hear from him in the next couple of days. And so that was it. And so Sammy's like super concerned. And so she goes to work on the 17th. And then when she gets back, she has a voicemail from Chris, who had called her at some point during the day while she was out. And on the voicemail, Chris tells her in a voice that was different than the past few days. The past few days, he was scared. He was really scared. This time, he is defeated. He was like resigned to whatever was going on. And he says to Sammy on the voicemail, he's under attack. And tonight, they're going to kill me. And there's nothing I can do. As soon as she's done listening to the message, Sammy calls Chris, but she can't get in touch with him. She knows she just talked to the police who were there at his apartment that day. They're probably just going to tell her, like, hey, wait until tomorrow. We just told you, earlier, just give it a couple days. And so she just decides that she's going to go to bed and she's going to try calling him again on April 18th. On the morning of April 18th, Chris didn't show up for work. And word got back to Sammy, who was already going to reach out to Chris that morning anyways. But, the friends and family are talking about what's going on with Chris. And so word got back to her that Chris had missed work. And so she calls Chris. He's not picking up from his landline. And now she calls the police back and she says, hey, you were there yesterday. I know it was locked, but he hasn't shown up for work today. Everybody's concerned about him. Can you please go over and check? And so the police go back over to Chris's apartment, and this time the front door is unlocked. And they go inside, and they're met with this very strange scene. You have all these crucifixes that are on the wall. You have the salt that lines every room in the house. There are all these candles that have burned down to the wick. There are little scraps of paper all over the apartment that were handwritten, little messages that Chris was leaving all over the house, warding off spirits and demons. I mean, it just looked like out of a Hollywood set for some demonic movie or something. And they search the house, and there's no sign of Chris. They're yelling for him. There's no sign of him. And they make their way into the bathroom where they discover Chris's body. Chris was in his bathtub. No water in the bathtub. He's fully clothed. There's all these candles all around the outside of this bathtub. There's, more crucifixes and weird relics that are in the bathroom with him. And he's on his knees, and he's slouched up against the wall with his hands kind of tucked against his chest. He had no external injuries. He was just dead. And so the police take Chris's body, and the coroner comes in and does a report, and it comes out that Chris died of natural causes. He died of a heart attack. And so when friends and family saw that that was his cause of death, they didn't buy it. They're like, I don't know how to describe what happened to him. But over the past 7 days, Chris went from this happy, healthy, successful guy to a complete raving paranoid lunatic. And no one knows why. It's certainly possible that it was just a very poorly timed heart attack, mixed in with someone having a psychotic break. Or some people say that he really was cursed by that woman in San Francisco, and that was the result. She said, you're going to die within the week, and he literally died within the week. And he described regularly over the phone to his friends and family as this was happening, these horrible experiences at night with these shadow beings in his room and it attacking him. It's just this crazy story that to this day leaves friends, family, and investigators baffled. So I'd love to hear in the comments what you think happened to Christopher Case. Was this a natural death, or was this something else? Let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to go through and respond to as many as I possibly can. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos like this one, I would encourage you to gently slap the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4 uploads that look an awful lot like the video you just saw. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is johnballin416. Also, I'm very active on TikTok, where my handle is Mr. Ballin, so the same as my YouTube channel. I also go live on TikTok Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. So I'd love to see you over there, or on Instagram, or on YouTube, or all these different places. But no matter where I see you, I really appreciate your support. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, take care.